Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Streaming Alchemy. I'm John Mahoney, and on today's show, we're going to revisit the gamification space that we talked about basically 2 weeks ago on our previous show. And we're going to look at how to do a trivia show foundation, a framework for doing that inside of vMix. So there's a lot of things that sort of tie together things we've done in the past, and hopefully a lot of new things in here that could make this interesting to everyone. So before we get to that, I'd just like to invite everybody, as we do at the start of every show, if you have any comments, have any questions, just post them. We'll try to get to everything here live to answer any of your questions, and we'll take it from there. Also, if you'd like to join us live on air, we have a link in the show notes and here on screen, so feel free to connect there, and we'll have somebody bring you live. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to start off by showing exactly what it is we're going to be implementing. So probably the best place to do is we'll take a look at the output from vMix here, and I'll talk through what this is like. So this is a game show that we set up. And again, like the other one, it's totally made up, but it has 3 players, and you have one player will start and they get to answer each question that they can get right within 5 seconds. And then if they get one of those questions wrong, it goes to the next player. Or if they time out on a question, it goes to the next player. So let me just show you how this would work. So we start the show up, and we say we're going to start our first round, and I launch a question. So what will happen is the question comes up, and if you see now, we have a circular band going around, and we just ran out of time, so it's moved to the next player. If this next player gets the answer correctly, they flash green, a bell chimes, and it's the next question, the countdown goes. If they get the answer wrong, that blocks that way, and then it goes to the next player. And this is basically how this works. If nobody can get an answer, you can just end the question and jump in, give the answer, and then when you start up, it throws away that question and comes in with the next. So this is what we're implementing in vMix on this time. So let me sort of end this so we're not beeping through the whole show. But so that's the framework that we're going to be working on. So before I get into how we broke all this up, let me jump over. I think we have a lot of comments sitting here already. So why don't we get to jumping in here? So we have Spatial Optic is saying, sweet, greetings and smellutations. Okay. I guess I should say thank you. But yes, thanks, Spatial. So what else do we have? So we have Marco Fabri. Hi, Marco. Good to see you here. We have You Demand. Great to have you here on the show. I know you posted some stuff that you're working on, and I really appreciate you taking the time to share what you're doing there in the group. So thank you. Let's see. We have Michael Quist. Michael, greetings back to Denmark from Trenton, New Jersey. So hope all is good with you. All right. So we have JP Nodet. Hello, JP. Great to see you here. And we have ISTV live. So hope you really find this useful and interesting. So thank you. So Michael is asking, he says, off-topic suggestion for a future show, vMix replay. We're using it efficiently in a one-man band with more than one camera. Okay, let me look, because that's not something I've done a lot with, but certainly be happy to sort of dive in there and see what I can share from that. Thanks, Michael. Okay, so probably a good place to start would be on the vMix side, and we'll go over how we've set up our preset for doing this game show. So if we jump into vMix, let me slide the audio off to the side because we're not really doing much interesting there. So the way I have this set up is that I have one main input and I layer everything that goes on screen into that one input. And so that's the first piece. That input is composed of my guest videos, or in this case, we're just using still images, but I could replace any of these with videos, and that would work fine. And then we start to have all the different elements. So we have sort of the element that is sitting inside, like behind all of the guests, and I'll tell you in a moment why we call that foreground. We have the mask that masks these players. So if I were to look at any of these players, when you have them set up, they are all using a mask here. So if I were to turn this mask off, you'd see that you get the full image, but these are all set up. And if I just put player mask on, it crops them and rounds the corners. And that lets each of these fit into the spaces inside this background image that we have here. Then I have something which is just, another layer with text that just sort of shows a time trivia game over here. Then we have a set of GT titles, and one of them does all of the major mechanics, everything from the scores to timers and everything else with that. The next we use to change the border colors, and I'll explain how I do that in a moment. And then we have a GT title, the third one, which lets us put up all of these questions. And so we're controlling that inside of shortcuts and scripting to make the questions go. And then the last thing is, let's see, in here we have also a video that is sort of playing in the background here. And that's, as I break up this show, let me go in here, the game show, let me go in here and show you the different layers. So if we start, and I'll sort of turn all of these off, and you'll start to see something. So what we actually did here, when we put all of these off, is we start with a video that has this motion going. And what you'll see is if I put this, click on the foreground image now, you'll see that this video is playing behind cutouts inside this foreground. So basically it's just sort of keyed into there, masked into there. So I am punching through this to create that. Then what I'm doing is I have right behind that player borders. And these player borders are inside the GT title player borders that we set up. And those are the ones that I'm manipulating. So I can hide these boxes, change their color, do all of that. And so that's how that piece is working in the mechanics, where it's stacked that way. And it lets me go and say, do you want to have that motion border? Do you want to have red or green for when somebody gets a question right? Or white, which is sort of the default, they're just sitting there waiting to play, get their next question. So that's how we handle all of that. The players, because they're masked, they're just sized to fit in here. So we have all the players. And then we're layering on, like we have the show title, which I told you about over here. And we have all the counters. So that's the big title, which round we're in, the scores, the timers, names for people, all of that. So all of that information for the names is being pulled out of basically a data source. So we have an XML file with all the player names, and we use Data Source Manager to populate that. So very similar to what we did a few shows ago to sort of just pull information out and drive Data Source Manager. The questions is over here, and this is also being driven through Data Source Manager. And that's how we pull that out. But that's how the vMix preset comes together and how I sort of broke this up to think about it. Now, all of this is being driven by scripting, which we'll get to next. So let me just check if we have any more coming in. So yeah, we have a few more comments. So we have spatial. Michael saying that's a nice trick, live video through the borders. Yeah, so one of the things that I'm always looking at ways that you can do the things that vMix doesn't have a native way to do. So that was one of them that I wanted to put in here. And it was actually one of the things we were considering for a show a couple of weeks ago to sort of put that in and show how to do it. But I thought it would be better in a larger show because there's more to it than just a single trick. The other piece to that, so because it's something that last week we talked about. We talked about different ways to change the colors in boxes or shapes. You know, triangles, rectangles, circles, which are the shapes sort of inside of vMix. And you can go and there is a set color command, which lets you go in and say, I want to take this title, this element, and something.source and change that to make that work. What I didn't talk about then, you know, you can talk with hex colors and do anything. In the color, there's actually alpha as well if you add it. So if I set something up where I want it to be white, that would be hashtag FFFFFF, which is sort of hex for 255, 255, 255 for RGB. But there was another 255, another FF at the end of that you can put for alpha. And so if you set that to hashtag all Fs 00, it becomes transparent. So you have the ability when using colors to make them transparent or to make them some degree of transparent. So if you just wanted to, so say somebody got something wrong on here, as opposed to just changing the border to green, what I could have done is I could have put a box over that, a shape over that, and make it, you know, green or red, but with a high level of translucency. So you still see the guest under it, but you just see it flash red on top of it. So things like that you can do. So in the colors, you have alpha channel. So that's a good point to add to how you can leverage color control with GT titles. So let me just sort of jump through a bit here. I want to make sure I cover all the key elements. So what we have in this is we have the ability to set up rounds and to display questions. So we're going to go through how we do that. We have an active player, and as you saw, the active player answers the questions, gets them right or wrong or timeout. So all of that is baked into the code. We have the border changes, which I've just talked about, how we do that. And we also have audio sounds that are triggering with all of this. So we have sounds for new question, somebody gets it right, somebody gets it wrong. We end the question because nobody could get the answer. So things like that. So probably the best thing to do now is to jump over to the script itself, and we can start digging into this. So the model for the script, what we've talked about in the past is you have something that runs in the background and it's just constantly looping. And what it's waiting for is some sort of command to tell it to do something. It does that thing, then goes back to waiting in the background for the next command. And that's the exact model we're using here. We've used it on the previous game show episode that we did a couple weeks ago. So we have basically the same model we used before with actions. So what we do is we use dynamic variable, dynamic value 1, and that gives us our action. So we have, like, I think a set of actions. So we have wait, right answer, wrong answer. It's like 0 is wait, 1, 2, 3, 3 is timeout, start and end questions of 5 and 6, and we have start round, end round is 7 and 8, and then end game is 9. So these are sort of the trigger points that we're using to instigate action in this background loop. So that's how this works in big concept. So if we scroll through, like usual, we set up all our initial points right up front for all the different variables we want, initial values. We keep player scores in an array. So this is stuff that we actually have figured out where to post this. So after this show, I will have a link for everybody to for you to download all of this. So after we do that, then we want to initialize things specifically for the game. So we want to turn around and sort of set all the scores to 0, the current round to 0. And there's a reason for that, because we bump it up right away in the start. So it starts at round 1. We have a current question, which we start at 1 and go from there. And then this is basically what I showed you. We initialize the action to just the wait action. We've commented what all the different actions mean. And then we initialize everything on the visual side. So this is basically driving off things that we did in last week's show, where we talked about how to control a GT title. And so we have all the things to set the text. So we're doing these double dashes for there's no value there. So things for the scores, the round, the timer, those were all sort of set to that double dash. And then we just do a specific initialization of the dynamic value, because up above we sort of said the action equals 0. So that's what we're using internally. But we are feeding the internal variable as we go down off of this dynamic value. So we set dynamic value to 0. That says just wait for dynamic value 1. And then dynamic value 2, which is the player that's active, we set them to 1. So we'll start at player 1 in this case. And then we queue up the question. So we're going to basically saying, go to the data source. And again, these are things that we didn't talk about last week, but are very, very similar in structure. So we have our data source, select data source row, which is which row in a data source. All our questions are in a data source. And we just say the table is questions XML. And we want the current question minus 1. And this is one of those things with vMix where some things are 0-based and other things are 1-based. So the row is 0-based. So you have to go back and say row 0 is the first question. But just so you're aware of that. And at that point, we just pop into a loop that's going to keep us running. So this is everything set up. The numerics and the visuals are all initialized. And then we just go into a big loop here. And in this loop, we start with, it's like we're waiting. We start a new round. It comes in, and we go and say, okay, let's update the round because it's a new round. So our first round is the first new round. So that's what I meant when we started at 0. We update it now to 1. So we're in round 1. And we're going and we're saying, make sure the countdown is stopped, because we have the timer on the side to count down. It's 5 seconds to answer a question. So we set all this up to say, make sure it's stopped, and make sure it's set now again to a 5-second timer. And then we just wait for the round to start. So that's all we're doing here. This next section here is basically just a set all the borders to default, so they're all white borders. Nobody's selected. The round hasn't started. And then we're just waiting for action 7, which is start rounds. So we sit here waiting for that, reading the XML, seeing if there's anything else coming in for a different type of command, or we want to change the player we're going to start the round with. You can do all that here. But then once the round starts, because it's going to sit right here in that chunk of code until it gets the command 7, which is the start round. And then it's going to go in and start to process each one of the commands that come in. And we're doing that basically by the dynamic value feeding into a case switch statement. So what we have here is now we're running this loop for the round. So we start the round, get everything set, run the round loop, and we just keep looking for the action and the active player. And then we're just saying, okay, what action do we want to do? And so the first one we said 0 is just wait, just go to sleep and come back in another quarter of a second. Case 1 is you got the right answer. Case 1 is right answer. Case 2 is wrong answer. Case 3 is you timed out. So in this, everything we're doing is we set the action to 0 because we don't want to keep saying you got right answers and it's looping. So you don't want it to double trip. So it's going to basically set the value back to 0. It will stop the countdown to make sure it's ended, reset it. because they got the right answer. So now we're going to go to another question. So we bump up the player score, sleep for 20% of a second, 200 milliseconds. And then we start to, let me see if I can do the wrap text, so it would be a little easier to read here. So now we're just going out and we're doing things to say, update the player's score because they got the answer right. So what's our active player? And update their score because that was an array we set up. And we highlight their border for green and we play they got their answer right sound. So that's all the code we're doing here. Then what we do is, because they got the answer right, they're still the active player because they can try to answer the next question in 5 seconds. So we go back and we set the fill color to that transparent color. So if you look right here, that's what we were talking about with adding the alpha channel value, and that's 0, 0. We've added to the end, and that gets that set. Then the other thing we're doing, because they got this right, the next thing I'm doing, and this is sort of the flexibility in here, I'm actually setting dynamic value 1 to value 5. And if you remember, value 5 was start a question. So they got the last question right. So what I'm telling it to do is when you finish doing all the processing for I got the last question right, start up and go to the next question, which is basically how we got everything sort of queued up for that. And so when I do this, it's going to go back, loop, and go to display the next question. So we're using this mechanism, this looping mechanism with an action to give us control over how we sort of navigate, even in here. So I can treat these, even though there are no functions that I can use inside of scripting in vMix, I can start to treat this case statement as like individual functions and call it from another case. So that's what we're doing here. And so when we set that up, we call the next, we set the next question, they bump up to the next question, and set that up, and then we play the sound for a new question, and boom, we basically end the right sound, play the new question sound, and we're done for that function. So that's basically how all of these are going to work. So the wrong answer is almost the same sort of thing. We're filling the color with green, with red instead of green for the border. We play the wrong music instead of wrong answer music instead of the right answer music. But we do all the things. We have to reset the countdown and do all of that. So the timer resets to 5. But the difference now is that we're bumping up to the next active player, because when you get it wrong, it passes to the next player. And that's what we're doing here. And because there's 3 players, we're basically coming back and say, if when we bump it up 1, the active player is greater than 3, then just loop back and set them to 1 again. So it basically is sort of like a modular. We keep jumping back to the beginning when we hit the end. And that's we're doing there. And so we set that now, because remember, the active player is kept in dynamic value 2. So we set dynamic value 2 to this new active player. And then we turn around and say, okay, this new active player, set their border to transparent. So they get the moving border around. And that's it. So we took the last guy, set their border to sort of red for the wrong answer, then timed it and put it back to default white. And then we set the new player over to the motion border. Again, very, very similar. I'm not going to go through everything in intimate detail here, but this will be up after today's show, and you'll be able to get at and go through it yourself. Timeout is very similar to the wrong answer, because it doesn't count. You don't get to keep the question, and we're doing all the same basic things except we play different sounds. But we're basically works pretty much the same way. We just have a timeout sound, and then we go in and jump from there to the next player. They still, because it's timed out, they don't bump up to the next question. They're still trying to answer the same question. So we have all of that there. And then this is, so if you go through here, this is case 3, which is timeout. Case 4 is for starting a question. And, we basically force a redisplay of the current question to get that set up and restart the timer. And basically, make sure that whoever the active player is, their border is transparent, so you see that motion border, and we display the question panel. Now, the way we're doing the question panel, because I know this was something that came up in one of the discussions inside the Streaming Alchemy group, is we're using these layers. And so I am doing a turn the question layer on, and that's that's layer 9, so it's up at the top. So layer 9 with the question in that consolidated input at the beginning of vMix is how we do all of this. And so we turn it on, and then you get to see the question come in. And, the end question kind of works the same way. I'm just going through and saying, okay, this question, nobody's going to get this, so we bump up the question and do all the things we need to sort of move to the next question. But we're going to turn around and say, we're stopping for a second so the host can go back. There is no selected guest, the selected player. Everybody defaults to their background, which is all white. And then we just go and play the end question music. And we, as I said, turn all the borders white. And then we go back here and say, okay, stop the countdown, stop all of that. And we have removed the question layer. So again, very similar structure to everything we're doing. That's how you pull the questions on and off, move to the next questions, and it keeps everything moving. The others, I don't necessarily have to go there. We're just, going and incrementing rounds or ending a round or doing those things. There's not a whole lot. That's more just I jump out of this loop and go back to the top and start over with the round incremented by 1, but does all the same things. So that's the basic structure of the script. So you can see it's very similar to what we did before. A lot more logic in this. But there are a few other things that I want to touch on. But let me get back to questions here, to comments here, and we'll see if let's see. So so value equals. So he says 2 commas. What is the different with the 2 dash? So let me see. So if you are talking about Stevie, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to make sure we answer the right question here. So if you're talking about why we're doing the 2 dashes, the 2 dash, all we're doing there is we're saying that there is no value, but the 2 dashes are a placeholder for a value. So as we're doing this, if that's in that initialization piece, if that's what you're talking about, that's why we're putting the 2 dashes in there. And the whole point in that is really just to let people know that we're going to fill this in. So as you look at this, we're getting ready for something. So we're not doing it as blank or putting a 0 in there. We were just saying sort of the game hasn't started. So it's not like they have a score of 0. They don't have a score. That was the only reason we put that there. That was an aesthetic choice. But if that's what you're talking about, that's why we're doing it. If not, just pop it into the comments again and we'll try to answer whatever you need. So let's see. So Maiko said, good structured code is simple, easy to maintain. So he loves it. Yeah, I think to make scripting useful on a commercial level, at least the way I look at this, you need to really have something that you have as a core template you use. And I think what I'm coming to with some of these things that I'm doing with scripting is having this sort of structure where I'm driving it off of 2 dynamic values for, a main action and then an argument, or a main action and a state, or something like that. That makes it easier to work in the future and change things. So I essentially start out with, I have my loop in the back with a case switch, a switch case statement, and I just figure out what logic I want to put in each of these, and it makes it easier. So I think as you start to integrate more scripting, for all of us collectively, that's a good way to approach it. Sort of take a framework and then stick with that and do theme and variation on that framework to adapt it to each different production. But the core of it now, the mechanics of it all will work. So that's kind of where my head was at in doing this. So I appreciate that, Mike, because I think it is important. The more code that you put in, the more important that becomes. The other thing about this is that it works very well even if you go outside of vMix scripting, go to something like Node.js, which I definitely would like to at least do another couple of shows on at some point during this season, because all of this code logic works almost identically then. You can in Node.js read these dynamic values, pull them in, and use that to drive whatever you're doing in Node.js. But Node.js gives you a great way to put things into functions. And that is definitely something that would be helpful as you think through this. If you can add more functions into that adds another level that you can just sort of pull out of a tool bag and plug in, as opposed to having that raw code sitting there. The function then just has a set of arguments in and a set of returns back, and it just does its thing. And as long as the function is well written, you're good there. Now, Michael's making another point. I completely agree. Doing something where I could set up colors, this would make it really easy, because say I didn't want to use white in the future for my color. So even sort of saying, like for Michael here saying to put like white, if I just turn around and say my default color is FFFFFF, that means that now all I'm saying is I want to use my default color here. And so it becomes even more generic. And I can have my wrong answer color, my right answer color. But that could be really useful if you're doing things with company branding or other things where you wanted to do things that had the specific colors of a client, which I think is, Michael's real point is that by having that, I change it in one place and it changes everywhere. And that is an excellent point. So thank you, Michael, for adding that. But yeah, this is the sort of thing where if you did that, it'd be very easy to adapt any of the scripts you do to sort of the color look of a particular client. And, this can be done for image assets as well. Because if you go there and say, if I'm going to set up all these things with different images, I actually plugged an image asset into my GT title. At the beginning of this, I could have different backgrounds for, again, different clients, different types of shows. And all I need to do is put the URL or the URI or file path for that image asset, and I could change it easily to go between different show backgrounds. So a lot of different things in this where if you abstract it more, it can make it very easy. So that was a very good point to get a discussion on, Michael. So thank you for that. Okay, so one last thing in this that I wanted to touch on, which I think is useful. How do I do the timers? Because we didn't really talk about that. So in the loop I have a section for you timeout. That's number 3 up here. And we sort of talked about what we do, where we sort of move to the next guess, keep the old question, don't update the scores, don't do any of that. But we didn't really say how you activate this. And so this is another one of those cases where these things start to become like functions for us. What I do is inside of the GT title counter, which counter 1, which is the GT title I'm using for all of the numerics on screen, I have my timer counting down. And inside that GT title, I have a trigger that when the timer reaches 0, it'll go and set dynamic value 1 to 3 to basically say, okay, so now when that timer is up, my vMix session just changes the dynamic value. But because I got this looping in the background, it just picks it up on the next loop and says, okay, I have a timeout. And it does all the timeout logic. So it's, again, another way to create this sort of link. And we're doing that with all the other things on here as well. So I have all of these things that I have set up here for here. This is all just shortcuts. And the shortcuts are being set with dynamic values for the most part, or specific things to start and stop scripts. That's how we start the show, and that's how we end it We just say start the script, end the script. But everything in here now is just setting dynamic values to trigger that. These things can be triggered from HTTP requests or, so there are a lot of different ways. But once you get to just having that decoupling where I'm not trying to tightly couple vMix with things, but I loosely couple it by saying I change the state over here and it creates an action over here. And having those two be able to work together, even though they're loosely coupled, can be very powerful. So I know we've sort of jumped in and covered a lot here, but what I want to do is make sure that we've really gone through everything that you guys were looking for, with what we showed in the beginning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap up this piece of show. We'll jump over to our post-show hangout, and we can dive into anything else, question-wise for how we did it, what the thinking was, and any other suggestions you have for things we could do different, better in the future, like, the something on replay, which was asked by Michael. So if you can hang around, that'd be great. If you can't, I'll see you next week, and have a safe, happy week. See you in the post-show. Take care. Okay. All right. Welcome back to the post-show hangout. Thank you, everybody, for hanging around and talking. I really enjoy this part of the show as well. So ISTV is saying data source, requesting for a future show. Yeah, if that's something that you like, we can go into Data Source Manager, how that works, how you set things up. It works with multiple types of data inputs, and it works with things like Google Sheets as well. So that would be something that you could have somebody update remotely and pick that up. So definitely a good subject. So thanks, ISTV. We'll add that to the list. Let me make a note. Okay, data source. All right. So Michael's saying, time for some GT magic also, if any, in the project. Yeah, so let me share that, because there were a few things we did, and I didn't really cover them. So one of the first things, so let me see, we can sort of switch over here and look at this. So one of the things that I always do when I'm working with GT titles is I have an image in the back where I usually snapshot the general screen layout that I'm working with. And this means that as I set everything up, I have a reference template. And then when I save it, I just turn that image off. But it gives me a reference guide for everything I lay out. So that's one thing. That's probably something that everybody else does, but it's just something to keep in mind. Let me open up one of the other templates here. Now, I don't need to save any changes here. And I'm going to open up questions. So this is, did I open up the wrong thing here? Oh, okay, good. So what is different here, and why did I do it that way? If you remember, when I go to another question, actually, let me switch back, and I'm just going to bring up the output of vMix here for a second so we can look at the show. So one of the things you'll notice, I'm just jumping through here. So it comes up with the first question, but if somebody gets it right, what you'll see is we push out the first question and we put the next question behind it. So that process of doing that, it required something specific in the way we set up GT titles. Let me stop that and we can switch back to the title here. So when you work with vMix, one of the things that you get with GT title inside of vMix, one of the things you get is the concept of layers. Now, layers, for most people, they just use layer one. It's the full screen and you have that all sitting there and that's it. But what you can also do is you can add additional layers. So if I'm here, I have layer two. And what you'll notice about layer two is right here along the borders of where this question appears. And what that means is when I do this sort of zoom fade where it pushes out and fades away, that's the transition we're using, we have this limited to the layer that asset is in. And so that's why we put this on sort of layer two. And the way we do that is we use something in the animations tab here. And if you go into animations, there's something that we can do a show on. There's a lot more inside of GT title that we haven't talked about. But we have data change in, data change out. What that means is when an element inside of this title changes, what do you want to do? And so this is sort of for general, what do I want to do? Nothing generally, but if the question text changes, so if it changed, let me go change out. I can change, so I got to have this all set here. Sorry if I don't. Let's see. Yeah, so it may not be set in this version that I said, but this lets me come back and say, every time that text changes, I want to do a zoom fade. So it lets me push that out and, basically put the next data set behind it. But because I created this on a layer, it basically clips at those edges. So otherwise, if I just had this on the full layer, that would go across the entire screen, sort of outside that box. So that's another bit of sort of GT title magic that we added to this to create that effect. But so everything else is pretty standard. So inside of the way we do the timers for the countdown timer, that's really standard. You can take any element that you have inside of your GT title and make that into a timer. But that's not done inside of GT title. Let's go over to my vMix screen itself, the program. And over here, this is the counter one. If I go to title editor, you can see everything I have here. And this counter one is the timer. And so I have this set up. And what I'm telling it to do is say, I want you to actually be a clock, and I create the settings over here. And now here I can say it's a 5-second timer. I want to show just the seconds and what's the current time on it. So this lets me set all of this up now in advance. And I can change all of these things. So if you saw inside, I was going and resetting the timer and making sure I reset it to 5 seconds. But this lets me do things where I can take any text field and make it into a timer. The timers can count up, they can count down. But that's how these two sort of tie together. And then, as I mentioned, in here, I'm using a trigger. So when the countdown timer is complete, just set a dynamic value. So that's it, the other piece to this. But so that's how we work with the timers on this. But there's a lot inside of GT title. GT title is one of those things where it doesn't have a lot of the sexy stuff, but there's a lot of tech in it. So it's really good that way. So if you do more of the imagery yourself and create sort of image-based assets, you can make it look really slick, and you've got a lot of mechanics running behind it. So Michael's saying that's a smooth trick on zoom on the text. So yeah, anything you do with a layer, that creates the end boundary. And there's lots of reasons you do this. Say you want to put a little indicator that could slide in to show which player has the serve or which team has the ball or any of those types of things. You may want that to slide in. You may have an indicator like at the bottom to say, what's the team and their score, but you may want the indicator to slide in from the right of the screen. So if you do that and you don't have that layer there, you're going to see that slide in going all the way across the screen. But if you put that into a tight layer, it's basically going to come in and just traverse that layer and fade in over there and fade out. So it gives you ways to create boundaries inside the bigger framework of your title that you can leverage for up, down, left, right transitions. So we have Hilson Ragfarpur. So hopefully I said your name correctly. He's asking for a date and time transition. So typically, the way you would do things like that is that you would have to track time, which you can do. You can do that in scripting. And when you track time, you can then, at a certain time, when you meet a certain requirement, past a certain time, you can then execute a script or issue a command inside of a GT title to take an action. So that would normally be the way it would work. But yeah, I mean, if you're talking about applying a transition inside a date and time, lots of things you can do to make that happen. You can create sort of folding effects and other things where if you wanted to make those, like those clocks which used to have the upper part of a number and the lower part, and it would flip down and you'd get the next time. And you see that? I mean, you could probably do things like that as well, and make those types of things happen. So if you're talking about creating the transition itself to do that look, that may be something, just interesting transitions and different ways you can use that. Another show. So let me add that there. Transitions in GT title. Okay, so thank you, Wilson. I appreciate that. So Spatial is saying, thank you for constantly thinking outside the box. Actually, just not to put too fine a point on it, but by creating that second layer, we were thinking inside the box, but just trivial point. No, thank you, Spatial. I appreciate that. So Michael's saying, combine data source with Google Sheets in the cloud, and how to use PowerPoint efficiently, maybe controlled by presenter on scene. Yeah, okay. Let me pull all these out because these are a lot of good show ideas. So data source, GT with Google Sheets, and PowerPoint control. Okay. Well, you guys are going to fill up the season with shows for me. This is great. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. So let's see. So Philippe L is idea for a future show, companion and Stream Deck tips and tricks. Okay, that's another one. Okay, thank you, Philippe. That's a good one there as well. And so Ryocaster is just dropping in to say hello. Ryo, always appreciate you joining us for the show. So thank you. So, all right. So I think this was a good post show. We actually covered a lot more stuff in depth, and hopefully you guys all found it useful. But I guess it's probably a good time to do a wrap up. So thanks everyone for hanging out a little bit longer with us here. And we will take some of these things that you've suggested here and see if we can convert them into future shows. But until next week, thank you everyone, and be safe, be well. I'll see you then. Take care.